All right. Hi, everybody. I think it's time for us to go ahead and get started. I'm Jacqueline McGinty, and I am the current director of the Commission for Community, Minority, and Non-Formal Education. And I want to welcome everybody and thank you for joining us in today's webinar. I want to introduce our speaker, Dr. Goings, who's been so kind to give of his time to share some of his research with us. Just wanted to let you know that Dr. Goings is an assistant professor of education leadership at Loyola University in Maryland, and he is the 2019 recipient of the Imogene Okes Award for his work and outstanding research in adult education. I'm not going to talk too much about him. I'll let him go ahead and introduce himself. One thing I did want to mention, though, is that if you have questions, we will have time at the end for Dr. Goings to answer your questions. If you want to post any questions that you have in the chat, we can wrap back around at the end and address those then. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Goings. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you everyone for taking time out today to talk about this important topic. Again, my name is Dr. Goings. I'm an assistant professor of educational leadership at Loyola University, Maryland. And actually starting in the fall, I'll be an assistant professor of language literacy and culture at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. So I'm in the current process of making a transition. The title of the webinar and presentation today is Supporting the Academic Success of Black Male Adult Learners in Higher Education. The way I want to go about discussing this topic is that first I want to kind of give you an overview of my research agenda to understand how this makes sense in the work that I've been doing to date. And then my personal connection to the topic. And from there, then I want to do some contextualizing about Black male adult learners in higher education. And then lastly, I want to share some findings from the study which won the 2019 award. And then we'll have some time, I'm hoping for maybe 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A or any, just have a conversation about things that are kind of on your mind as you're thinking about this topic. So for me, as a researcher, I came into this work on adult learners actually being someone who was from the K through 12 side. So my background actually was a music education teacher as well as a special education teacher. But as I was doing my research, looking to earn my doctorate, I started to find that in the literature on Black males in higher education, which was what I wanted to focus on for my dissertation, is that there was a lot of focus on traditional age students, our typical 18 to 24-year-old, but there was nothing really focused on adult learners. And we know from the data, which I'll share in a little bit, is that, adult learners are the fastest growing population on our campuses. And I just always wonder why there was no literature. And what one of my committee members said is like, when there's no literature like that, you make it, and you can make it your own. So again, that really informs my agenda, which is really focused on how do we reimagine the success for students in education of color pre-K through 20. So again, because of my K through 12 background, I look at how does K through 12 inform what happens in higher ed, and then what happens in higher ed, how does that inform who students in K through 12 have access to? And I look at this through three or four buckets. One is focused on gifted and high achieving Black male success. I find that with Black males, when we start talking about them, we often focus on failures. And my idea is that why don't we focus on those who are successful and replicate what we can learn from their success. With that, from that research, it becomes very important at the K through 12 level to really focus on who is in front of Black male students during the K through 12 experience. And so what I'm finding in the quantitative and qualitative research is confirming that this is that Black males benefit when they have access to other Black teachers in their classroom. So really my research agenda has focused on how do we diversify the teacher and school leader workforce. Because if we look for African Americans in particular, they're only 7 to 8% of the teaching workforce. So I'm looking at how do we get more into the pipeline of teaching, and then how do we help them get to the pathway through leadership so they become principals, assistant principals, and have leadership roles in school districts. And then lastly, because I'm looking at success, I'm often interested in how is equity and access given to Black males and then students of color more generally in gifted programs. Because we find that's often a pathway to higher education is through gifted and talented programming. And then lastly, because of just attending a historically Black college and university for my doctoral degree, I'm very interested in what is the role that HBCUs play in the success of Black male students and students of color more generally in higher education. And then looking at what is the impact that they have on students once they leave campus and impact society. From that work, I'm really interested in how do we reframe these narratives. So my research agenda, and if you read anything that I write, it's often focused on anti-deficit perspectives. Because again, we know a lot about why.
Them or not.
thinking differently about problems we often look through a deficit lens at. And then from there, the second piece is Gilman Whiting's scholar identity model. And I'm very interested in, and this is particularly about Black males, is how do Black men develop scholar identities, whether it's in K-12 or higher education? And then lastly, looking at the bioecological systems theory, we can't just say that Black men have success in schools because of what they did on their own. We know that there's environments that play a role. And so I'm very interested in what are the environmental factors that influence the success of Black male adults. My personal connection to this is actually, I'm the son of an adult learner. And for me, I never really thought about this until after I started doing the research. So this was not something I necessarily came into the work with. But, for me, in this picture is myself and my mother, and this is we graduate on the same day. So that's why we're both in our cap and gowns, but at different universities. So I'm, at this point, I'm a master's student. I'm earning my master's degree. My mom's earning her bachelor's degree. We're from the state of Connecticut. So I was a student at Post University in Waterbury, Connecticut, and she was a student at University of Bridgeport in Bridgeport, Connecticut, which is about 30 minutes away from each other. So we had to literally on this day split up the family and have folks go and attend each of our graduations. But this started 4 years prior to when I was, or 6 years prior to when I was a sophomore in undergrad, and my mom kept talking about going back to school. And I just wondered, I said, why you keep talking about it? You forced me to go to college and you made sure that I succeeded. So why don't you go back? You kind of practice what you preach. And so she said, as long as you help me, I'll do it. And so that's what we did. And so this is kind of a culminating experience from that we both graduated the same day. And now she's gone on to earn her master's in social work, and she's a clinical licensed social worker. So things kind of progress over time. It's just interesting to see how our relationship developed. But you'll see a lot of college students have this experience now. We're no longer having those traditional age students. We have a lot of folks with various responsibilities, including having children. So, my experience with my mother is probably something similar to what I've seen in the research that I've done. But again, this is kind of my personal connection to the topic. Now, when we look at the literature, because I want to give some scholarly context for this issue, when we look at the literature on Black men in higher ed, oftentimes what is found in a lot of this work, when we're talking about Black men in higher education, is focused on how they're successful in athletics, and oftentimes what are their music aspirations, if they want to become a rappers. A lot of times this narrative, let's say deficit narrative, is portrayed about Black men in higher ed, but they're often not looked at as academicians, so those who succeed academically. And with that, because of that, the research, particularly from Sean Harper, Terrell Strayhorn, Sharon Friesberg, and others, have found that Black men, particularly at predominantly white institutions, often experience stereotyping, racism, and somehow an isolating college environment. So that can be from having the experience of being the only Black male in your program, or to being subjected, say, in the STEM environment when you go into labs that professors do not assign you. Either they have these opportunities where they want to assign groups, and then as the Black male, you may not have someone who wants to work with you. So that, again, that makes you feel isolated in those learning environments. And then when we look at the literature on Black men in higher ed, a lot of the literature has focused on traditional age Black men. And it's just because of and this is how I went into the research, just my idea of who college students were. I often thought about it myself, an 18-year-old who started and kind of progressed right through, but that's just not who our college students are today. I think it's important not only to have the literature, but then just to look at the data and kind of what does the data suggest in terms of where do Black men, when they first enroll in college, where do they go? And so if we look at kind of the top row here, for Black men in post-secondary institutions, 41% attend a public 2-year college. So we think about a large group of Black men eventually end up at a community college. And as a result, a lot of research has focused in this area, particularly from Luke Wood, Dr. Luke Wood, Frank Harris, and others have really focused and dug deep into this topic about what are 2-year community colleges doing to support the transition of Black men into 4-year institutions. What I find also very interesting from this data is that this idea that Black men are at 38%, if I combine the two cells, are attending for-profit institutions. So I think there is something that we have to look into, is like, what about for-profit institutions are attracting Black men to enroll? But what I'm going to do now is, this is where Black men go, but I want to look at, well, what happens when they get to these types of institutions? What does their graduation look like? Kind of what does the output look like? And so here, if we look at, again, this is for first-time Black male bachelor's degree students at a 4-year institutions. We look at the graduation rates. If we look at the 4-year, The blue is for public institution, the green is for private, and the yellow is for profit. If you look at the 4-year graduation rate, it's relatively low across all institutions. And that's just something that's in higher ed more generally. So oftentimes we look at the 6-year rate, so kind of the three groups on the group on the right. And when we look at that, if we look at public institutions, Black men have a 34.7% graduation rate in 6 years. For private institutions, slightly higher at 36.4%. But then we look at for-profit institutions, 23.4%. So again, they're enrolling a large number of Black men, but then when we look at the output, what happens on the back end in terms of graduation, we see the discrepancies, particularly in the for-profit space. And now, that's some of the data in terms of where Black men are situated. But when we look at adult learners in higher ed, because for me, I'm trying to combine in some ways the research in adult education and higher education to kind of blend together. So we look at adult learners, they're the fastest growing population on college campuses. Then we look at Black adult learners or non-traditional students, depending on the literature you read, that may be referred to that. 65% of Black collegians identify as non-traditional based on their financial independence. So you're talking about Black students, we have a large number of Black students who fit into this category. And then what I find in the literature on adult learners in higher ed, a lot of the literature has been focused on Black women in terms of them being reentry students into the college space, whether that being as mothers or just their experiences coming back to school later in life. But there was limited studies on Black men. Again, that was just a limitation of the research on Black men in higher education. And just some quick definition of how I kind of approach defining adult learners. I'm borrowing from the Horn and Carroll definition. There's these 7 characteristics of adult learners. So delayed college enrollment, part-time enrollment in college, financial independence, full-time employment while enrolled in college, having independence or dependence in that, this should be saying in that way, single parents, and did not receive a traditional high school diploma. And I'm just curious, for those who are watching, if you could raise your hand, how many of you had at least one of these characteristics when you were a college student? Just curious. So again, a lot of students fall into this category of having these experiences, myself included. When we look at the Black male adult learner research, there were 2 particular volumes that really served as like the foundation work that I've sought to kind of build off of. These swimming upstream volumes in the New Directions for Adult and Continuing Education. They've really done a great job of capturing broadly what's happening for Black males in adult education. And some of the articles in both these issues focus on the experience of Black male adult learner collegians. And so I'm very interested, and this is a piece, if you're interested in this work, I suggest you grab both of these volumes because they're really informative about the work. And so for me, then I sought to build off of the work. And so some of my initial work in this particular piece published in 2017 in the Journal of Men's Studies, I focus on doing an analysis of what are the differences in experiences for traditional age students and Black male non-traditional students in a historically Black college or university, in particular with the interactions with faculty. In this particular study, I found that for adult learners, they had a slightly different experience in interacting with faculty because they had very much expertise in some of the areas they were studying. So they talked about in class how sometimes they had to, one student described it as not outshining the master, and for them, the master meaning their professor. So they had to figure out ways to circumvent. Sometimes they said that professor was wrong when they would say things in class, but they didn't want to call them out because they said, at the end of the day, I got to make sure I get this A in this class so I can move forward. So it's kind of always navigating these politics with professors. In another piece, some of my original work in 2016, redefined the narrative, focused on just Black male adult learners at HBCUs and how they redefine the narrative and why they're successful. Some of the factors of success ended up being internal. So them wanting to succeed because they had this drive to do better for themselves. But then also they encountered faculty and support on campuses that really helped them propel them along. And then lastly, I have 2 conceptual pieces, just kind of laying out the foundation for this, because I was just very interested as I was looking through the adult education journals and looking for more literature, I was just not finding any. So I wanted to really put out this call for us as those who are concerned and really thinking about this topic to start doing research on it, because I think there are a large number of Black men who may not finish in that 6-year time frame that we could be strategic about in higher ed to bring them back. And so again, I want my research to inform those recruiting and retention practices. And so now I want to kind of share, that's really the context for the study. This study that I'm going to share was actually published in Adult Learning in 2018, titled Making Up for Lost Time, the Transition Experiences non-traditional Black male undergraduates. And then I hope maybe at the end of this webinar, we can send out, when we send out the link for this, also send out the article so folks can have it as well. I think that would be helpful. And for the study, I had two central questions that I was very much interested in. Again, what life events do non-traditional Black male students explain led them back to college? I was very interested, like not only what happens, but are there events, particular events in someone's life that brings them back? Because I think sometimes we can use those to kind of inform our recruiting practices or things that we do on campus. And then lastly, it's not only important to figure out what events bring them back, but then what institutional agents and programs on campus do these men utilize to support their academic success? And I go institutional agents and programs because in my previous work, I focused on individuals, so faculty, staff, but I'm very more, it can't be all on the onus of faculty to provide these supports. It has to be on the institution to kind of create an institutional approach to supporting adult learners. And so I was interested, are there any institutional agents and programs that these men utilize on their campus? And in order to kind of look through this issue, I use Schlossberg's transition model. Again, I was interested in their transition to campus. So this model was very helpful in that. And these kind of three buckets, if you will, the transition characteristics. So what was the transition like? What led to it? What events happened before and during this transition? What's the environment look like for someone when they experience a transition? So environment referring to, do you have family and support systems in place at your home? Are there supports when you get to, say, the campus for this particular study? And then lastly, what are the characteristics of the individual experience in the transition? So for me, I'm interested in what's the intersection of race and gender, particularly for Black men. How are they experiencing as being a Black male transitioning back to college? And then these characteristics inform how does someone adapt to a transition. And so again, because I'm interested in what events led them to coming back and then what supports did they use, I wanted to know how do they adapt to this transition as well. For the methodology, again, I used Horn and Carroll's characteristics, which I described earlier. For this particular study, I wanted to at least have participants that had two of the characteristics. Horn and Carroll defined they have a moderate adult non-traditional student, and so I wanted to kind of use that criteria to help me inform the study. So all the men in the study, which I'll share in a second, had at least two of these criteria. In order to collect data for this study, I used Twitter, Facebook, and personal networks, and then professors in the field who had adult learners on their campus. And then I also interviewed those who were currently students as well as those who had finished to kind of have them reflect back. They all received the demographic survey to give me information about what were their non-traditional student characteristics, what was their major, GPA, what they were doing currently, what was their education aspirations. And then to actually answer the questions, I conducted 2 semi-structured interviews with all participants. Interviews lasted between 45 to 90 minutes. In one particular interview, actually, I'm sorry, a little bit longer, 2 hours for the longest. I told them, I said, can you tell me about your educational experiences? And that was the only question I asked one of the participants. And they answered all my questions in 2 hours, and I just had to guide them a little bit, which is one question that kind of started. So I really appreciate the men. They were very willing to come forth with the information in this study. Then I collected documents related to the academic journey. Some had schedules to talk about how they manage their lives. Some talked about their children, and then how one particular participant talked about how his children, them getting A's on their report card motivated him because he was getting B's at the time. And so he said, I gotta outdo my children. And so they had a competition. So he showed me the grades at the end of the semester and then the child's quarter. So it's, things like that were very informative to the study. If you can see in the chart here, the table, it says all 13 participants in the study. And you can see from the types of colleges attended, a majority of them did go to community college initially. So again, that kind of confirms some of the data that we look at nationally in terms of where the Black men enroll. Some went to multiple institutions. So if you see a number in parentheses next to the institution, that means they went to 2 different or 3 different types of those types of institutions. So for instance, if we go down to Darius, he went to 3 different 4-year public predominantly white institutions along his academic journey. So a lot of these men have went to various institutions and then persisted. I was very interested in, like, a lot of them went to different places, and why did they persist? We look at various different majors. And then if you look at what their education aspirations are or their degrees in pursuit, they're all looking to continue their education in some form. At this point in time, I had one person who had earned their doctorate, Dr. Carey, but since this study has been completed, Travis, he just earned his doctorate last month. So I was able to see his dissertation defense, and he's done. So he's Dr. Travis now, and also Bill. He's now Dr. Bill. He earned his doctorate last year. So again, the folks are actually continuing with their education, even though they started as adult learners. There were three central findings in this particular study. One was titled Facing Life Realities and Proving Them Wrong. And I put proving them wrong in quotations because them were a lot of people. Them referred to teachers in K through 12, as well as family members who thought they couldn't do it, in addition to college personnel that thought that maybe they should leave school for a time and not continue. The second finding talked about making up for lost time, which I found interesting, which confirmed my own experience with my mother, just feeling like, I lost a lot of time, and some of them lost a lot of money not having a formalized education degree because they felt that they reached a financial plateau, and they thought that, I got to make up for this lost time. And then lastly, these inconsistent institutional supports. Again, for this study, I was interested in institutional support. It was just very inconsistent across institutions, and I'll share some of that with you. When we look at the first thing of kind of proving them wrong in facing life realities, I had one participant who discussed this idea that he said, I was trying to make college feel like home, but it just didn't feel like home. My academics suffered, and I dropped out after my first year. So for George, his experience was being from a more rural town and then going to, actually in this case, a historically Black college that was in a neighboring city, but just feeling like he couldn't make that home atmosphere at the university. And so he decided to leave at that point in time. Again, you start to see this as why the folks left the institution. Some people also left the institution or left college or didn't think about pursuing education because they feel like, I was already making good money. And like I said, they ended up hitting a plateau. But Raheem was interesting in this particular case because he said, and I was highlighted in the red, he said the reason to go into school was to make money. And just to kind of give a summary of his experience was that Raheem at data collection was 62 years old, was a millionaire. He had earned his millions in construction management and felt that he didn't need school, but he went back to school only to go back to school because he wanted to teach construction classes at a community college. And he said that he would go for interviews and people wouldn't hire him or look at him because he didn't have a degree. And he thought that was unfair, but he realized, he said, I make millions, I'm an expert in this, but I can't get a job teaching people how to become experts because I don't have a degree. So again, this became the impetus of him kind of proving them wrong and going back to school because he knew he wanted to make an impact. But earlier in his life, he didn't see that as important. He left school in the 8th grade and didn't need to go back. He said, I learned enough in the 7th grade that I didn't feel like I need to go back. He just a very interesting experience as someone who I just need to write a case study about him in particular. He's had a unique story and unique life experience. For Bill, he talks about, he says, now I think I'm 54 or 55, I think. He laughs about this. He doesn't like to keep math. He doesn't like math. And he said he doesn't like to keep up with the number on his age. So he just always jokes about that. He said, I'm not sure what age I am, but he talks about that. He says, and it was this experience with my 3rd grade teacher that affected me literally throughout my entire life. I mean, all the way to my, if you will, uncompleted undergrad degrees. I'm thankful I didn't let that stop me. And so what Bill is referring to, in the 3rd grade, his 3rd grade teacher called him dumb and said he would never amount to anything. And so you could imagine a man who's 54, 55, that has his 3rd grade experience of maybe 7, 8, 9 years old, and that is impacting his life moving forward. But he always said that he wanted to prove them wrong, in particular his 3rd grade teacher, which now he's Dr. Bill and he has proved them wrong in his mind. We kind of joke about it now. And then Cole suggested that, and then I was determined to not be a statistic because people say, once you drop out of school, you never go back. And I said, well, I'm going to go back. And there's this idea, and I also kind of subscribed to this idea before starting this research agenda, just the idea of what does it mean to leave college? I often thought that, once you leave, you become part of the statistic and you don't come back. And I was just misinformed and having that perspective. And so I understand what Cole is meaning. Once you drop out, he wanted to prove folks wrong, that I'm not going to be that statistic. And you'll see there's a lot of students who are contemplating that not being that statistic. And when we look at the second finding in terms of making up for lost time, Henry describes, he said, at the time, my goal was just to go ahead, get that 2-year degree and just be done with it. Well, going through the process and going to classes, I kind of saw that, hey, I love this. I love education. I love learning. It was just a no-brainer for me after that. I just figured that out. It was like a no-brainer. Might as well just keep going forward, keep going, trying to get your education as far as it can go. And so I found a lot of participants in this study had that similar mindset. It's like they were apprehensive about going back to school because of those being a statistic and trying to prove people wrong. Sometimes that put some pressure on participants. But when they got back to school and got into the classes, they found they actually loved what they were doing. And that once they found that love and that passion, they wanted to see it through to the end. And I had another participant who just talked about that for him going through education was to get his doctorate. So once he started, he said, I got to finish, and finishing means the doctorate. So I thought that was interesting. And Travis, what he mentioned, he talks about this experience he had in class. He said, I remember one of the guys in the class got arrested, and we had a rap session in class. And he said about what we could do and what our potential was as Black men. And he said, I was like, I want to do something with my life. I want to be somebody. I just made a decision to push forward. And in this particular class, he's talking about, this class was in his community college, and he felt that he had a Black male professor, and he thought that was very important to his trajectory academically. Because he felt like in this class, he was able to have a rap session, which is just a grouping of individuals to kind of talk through what they're experiencing. And he felt that if he didn't have a Black male professor, that experience might not have happened in the class, for them to kind of really talk about what's happening, what their potential was as Black men. In this particular class, he also talked about, too, in the community college setting, it was all Black men in his class. So he said that particular environment felt protective for him, and he felt that he could be himself and really open up, and they all push each other forward to succeed in the community college. And now for the final finding is just the inconsistent institutional support. And my idea is like, where are the programs? And participants talked about this. Bill said at JU, they had some sort of adult learner program. He said, when I went to JU, I was in my 30s. And with the program, I never felt isolated. So other 13 men too talked about these programs that were available to them. And oftentimes these were this particular program was for adult learners, but some programs were not. They were often these transition programs for those who have who are coming from community college to a 4-year institution. And then Travis talks about, as a transfer student, orientation was very generic. But there I had people point me in the right direction of how to go with how to go to the writing lab, math labs, and how to use professors' office hours. So again, Travis had this experience where he had access to people who could support him, but because it was a transfer student orientation and not something particularly geared towards adult learners who may have some unique differences than just a transfer student, he felt that it was very generic. And I found that in a lot of the men I've talked to in this particular study and the work that I have coming up now. Just this idea of there's no necessarily targeted programming for adult learners. And then Carson, he talked about, and a number of the men had children, and his statement kind of summarizes what happened. He said, to be honest with you, if I didn't have a girlfriend that would look out for my son or something at that particular time in college, college wouldn't have panned out. So this idea of child support in ways that he could go to school, because he was thinking about, how am I going to take care of my son? And so we know a lot of students, and considering what's happening now with COVID-19, before, thinking about the future, just what are folks doing with childcare and how do we work and manage all that? So you could imagine what's happening for our students right now who are trying to think through this in terms of childcare and getting work done. But Carson really pointed this out. And then when I asked him for more detail, he was even asking, like, can we just, could the school just give me a list of childcare providers that are around the university? So, because he's like, I wasn't familiar. So it'd be a way to kind of connect him with supports in the local community. And now, given the findings, we pull back some things that I really think that we should be intentional about when we're looking at supporting Black male adult learner success is that where are we providing spaces to build community with other Black men? I think that becomes important, particularly when I talked about the experience Travis had with having a Black male professor in a class with Black men, having that opportunity to build community. That became very important for his trajectory. And then what's I think is another piece that's important is that we need to have strategic and intentional programming for Black male adult learners. Oftentimes we may have a program focused on adult learners, but given the unique experiences that Black men have, and you can make the case for other racial gender groups as well, sometimes I think we need to make space to have intentional and strategic programming that represents their unique experiences on college campuses. And then third, looking at how do we provide access to affordable childcare for adult learners? I think that becomes a major piece in this. We're looking at Black male adults. And it was interesting, in this piece, I got some reviewer feedback that really was focused on why we care about that for men. And I thought that was very interesting that, that Black men, it seemed that it was a women's issue. And I thought that was unfair because we have parents that need support for their children. And I think we just have to be intentional about that. And I think one way we can even do that is that having childcare centers on campus, it gives an opportunity to bring some additional revenue into the institution. I know there are licensure requirements and things that become somewhat of a headache, but then also we're getting our education students, we have education programs on campus, clinical hours and experiences working with someone who's an experienced educator in these environments. So I think it's an opportunity to really give like a lab environment for our students, college students, as well as providing a service for students who are taking classes, and as well as faculty and staff. I think we all go through that depending on where you are. And then lastly, improve the messaging about Black men who have at some point left college. Again, one of the participants said, I don't want to be a statistic. Oftentimes when people say people leave college, that they don't ever come back. And so I think we have to be intentional about our messaging and how we are talking about Black men. In a Google search I did, Black male success, and I found these articles that all focused on, they referred to Black men as endangered species on college campuses. And I just found that it's interesting that it's ingrained in various aspects of society, including Google searches. So, I think we have to be intentional about how we message colleges. And again, I think we have a large population, if we look at the data that suggests that, Black men may not experience success in a 6-year graduation rate. So we have a lot of men that are there that may be taking classes or maybe taking, introductory classes, or maybe just in the workforce, that we can be strategic and build these workforce partnerships where we, work specifically with companies to bring their men and adult learners more generally back to campus. So I think it helps us in terms of students, and we're thinking about tuition and increasing our student population, but it's also beneficial to businesses because then they have a more educated workforce. So I think we can work hand in hand in that way. And then I think an important question from this study that I continue to just kind of think through, it's like, if we acknowledge that adult learners are fastest in our largest college student population, why are institutions not more responsive to their needs? Like, the numbers are showing this vast increase, but it still seems like we're kind of like in this old model that we're thinking through 18 to 22-year-old, and we're going to lose students. And you're seeing that particularly now, for those institutions who are not strategic in recruiting adult learners, the future is not bright. It's just harder and harder for students who are really thinking about and being intentional about where they go to college more now than ever. So I think we have to be mindful of this, and do we put those supports in place? And then again, how are those supports really looking at, for me, because I research black men, like how are they supported to those needs of like the racialized and gendered experiences of Black men on campuses, or for any group for that matter. But I just think we need to keep those in mind when we're thinking about our programs. In some areas, I think for those, I see Charles Jackson on here is kind of taking this research up and kind of moving the needle forward. I've had a couple of the students reach out who are kind of thinking about this work moving forward. Some areas I think that we can explore is that what are the impact of a Black male adult learners returning to college on their children's educational aspirations? I'm finding that more and more as I talk to men who have children, they often talk about their children pushing them to go to school, but then in return, somehow them going to school motivates their children to do well. They often talk about, they see them at the table doing work, so they come with their book and do their work. So I think that's one area that we should look at. And then, most of my work has focused on student experience, but I think we need to look at the faculty side and focus on what are some strategies that they've used to be successful with Black male adult learners. Because there are faculty who are doing it. I hear it in the studies that I do. But then looking at the faculty side, because we may be able to inform faculty development. So it may not just be that institutions are not responsive, just we may not have all the information we need to be responsive. So from the faculty side, like what is our teaching? How are we approaching our teaching for adult learners in particular? And then lastly, exploring the types of programming that universities provide for adult learners to assess if there are any focus on Black men specifically. I focus on this because I've seen this uptick of either male minority initiatives or sometimes even Black male initiatives on campuses, but oftentimes they're geared towards a traditional age student. So how are we being mindful of our Black male adult learners when we're thinking through these programming opportunities? And that's really a summary of the work. I really thank you all for taking the time to listen. It's just very important, and I think we just need more researchers doing this work and just opportunities like this to kind of get this on folks' radar, because we have adult learners who we can recruit and bring back to campus and retain them and then graduate, and that could be a very important piece to the financial stability of higher education. I think we just need to be more intentional about it. And so I guess we can open up for Q&A. I'm not sure if there's questions in the chat or if just folks want to chime in.
I don't see any questions currently in the chat, but if anyone wants to put theirs in the chat, I'm happy to field those as well, or you can just go ahead and
or comments or things you're thinking about. I'd really love to hear anything you got.
Well, I unmuted my mic. Can you hear me? This is
Yes.
Lisa Brown. Yeah, I was wanting to reiterate the characteristics of your participants.
Sure.
Did you indicate that they tended to be more motivated? Because typically most of the research kind of comes with this deficit model as it relates to Black men, but your particular group, were they, in terms of their background, tend to be more successful students?
No, not starting out, no.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they all talked about that at some point. I mean, I had two that dropped out of high school, and then later got their GED and came back. I had a number who just did not do well. They got through high school barely. I had one particular Bill, he was homeless from the age of 13 to 20. And so they had all these other life things that were just in the way. And it wasn't never that they didn't want to succeed academically. So I think that's a piece we have to differentiate. I think they all wanted to do well academically, but there were a lot of environmental factors that were playing a role in just how they were approaching schooling at that particular point in time.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was a great question.
We had a comment from Christy Rhodes and a thank you for the presentation, but that she wanted to know if there one aspect of your work research that surprised you.
I think when I first started this, the fact that I had someone 62 years old reach out to say that I'm in college, I just never, that was just so, just to think of the older age of folks going back to college, that was just never in my mind to really think about that. And again, this is how I started around this research more generally, because initially for my dissertation, I just focused on high achieving Black men at historically Black colleges and universities. And I thought I was gonna get an 18 to 22-year-old, and the first 3 people were non-traditional students that were older in age. So that continuously surprises me. And then for me, it's just part of the resilience, and it continues to be a surprise. Like, despite all these life obstacles, like I couldn't imagine being homeless for 7 years. For Bill in particular, he just talked about his mom. His dad passed away when he was 8, and then his mom had some mental health issues, and then left the family, just deserted the family, and him and his brothers. And so just the fact that he went to school every day, even though he didn't do well, he went to school to eat. And I just could imagine having those types of experiences and then still succeeding, persisting. And then now he has his doctorate. I mean, that's just, for me, just something that continuously surprises me about the work.
I have another couple of questions that
Sure.
are coming in the chat here. So from Karen, just had mentioned that she can't actually go off mute at the moment.
Sure.
So wanted to know if you could expand a bit on where online education fits into supporting students in persistence and degree attainment. And she says she asks because particularly in today's climate where we are all at home and online, curious if this came up in your research when you were speaking with participants.
It did not, and that may be just something I just did not focus on at the time. It's something that I've been thinking about more, not only for this work, but I do work again in K through 12 and teacher education. And then when I look at the data on where Black male teachers earn their teaching credential, on the top 5 institution, the number 3 institution is an online, predominant all online institution. So I have to turn my work in that direction, because I think that's, because again, as I mentioned in the context of literature, I'm just very interested in what motivates or what aspects about online education push Black men to attend those types of institutions, and then what's their experience once they get there. So I think that's going to be something I focus on next for my work.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Another question from Daryl says that you mentioned professional development, and he's wondering what you think this professional development would look like.
You know, part of that, I think, oftentimes we do professional development without the needs of our, say, consumer in mind. So I think first for me, I think it's like to do a needs assessment of how best do, say, in this case, Black male adult learners learn, or, you know, or what do they feel like they need from their faculty members or staff on campus, and then create the professional development from there. So I'm not sure. From my experience doing this work, though, I think a piece will be on faculty and their teaching. Oftentimes, a lot of them felt that the lecture style approach to teaching just was not effective for them. They just talked about, like, I gotta, you know, my attention span is about 15 to 20 minutes and I need to be up moving, doing something. I've been in the workforce, I've been moving, always doing something. And they felt like they needed that to be responsive to how they learn. So I definitely see that being part of it. Just this idea, I think sometimes to have adult learners sit in front of faculty to talk about this, like sometimes there's no exchange of just dialogue. So to create town hall environments, or just, you know, small spaces where faculty and students can get together and just talk about what are the needs. That could be the start of building a professional development. And I'm not quite sure how that would look. Some of this is institutional specific. So I'm trying to think of particular predominantly white institutions. If you find that a lot of your Black men have experience with racism and on campus, is like really figuring out how do we dismantle those types of systems on campus. I think that's something that's needed there. And then, you know, for instance, how do faculty talk to their adult learners might be a piece just from that alone. Yeah, there's so many different ways and so many different aspects in order to provide that professional development.
It's a really good point that you make too, and just thinking about what you said earlier about universities, you know, adjusting and being more accommodating to adult learners. That at my institution, I frequently hear faculty talking about the kids, you know, and younger learners, and thinking of that typical 18 to 22-year-old, but at the same time, I hear a university also talking about being more accommodated to adult learners. So I could see that professional development, as you mentioned, going with the faculty too.
Yeah.
There are a couple more questions here in the chat from Dr. Lisa Brown. Asked, were Black women particularly sources of support for most of the men in the study?
Yeah, and I will say that yes, in the majority of their stories, they talked about Black women in particular. For those, particularly at HBCUs, that was a central part of their narrative. Whether it was a Black woman faculty or a Black woman like administrator or staff. That was and continues to be. You see that in literature more generally on Black men. Yes, that definitely was a factor.
Yeah, and I see she had a follow-up comment there, particularly Black women as professors or administrators they engaged with.
You said, I'm sorry, there was a follow-up to that?
She had just mentioned a follow-up in the chat about when she asked the question, particularly saying Black women as professors or administrators.
Okay, yeah. That's
actually, yes, and you mentioned HBCUs. I actually was more interested in PWIs. What were their experience with maybe the limited amount of exposure they may have had to Black female professors and administrators, and did they find them in that environment supportive?
No, oftentimes when they found them in community colleges and HBCUs, but when I think through the folks I've talked to for this study and others, I often don't hear anything about them having access to Black staff or faculty or administrators in a predominantly institution space. And that hasn't been a space of support for them. They often say that, though, that they connected with other students who have connected them with faculty or staff at other institutions, which I find interesting. Like they've used the internet to kind of circumvent their own institution to find supports and help to navigate from Black faculty. But it wasn't always on, in my research, hasn't been on the actual university that they attend. Which is sad. I mean, that just speaks to what's happening in predominantly white institutions in higher ed, just in terms of faculty recruitment and retention.
And thinking back to, you know, adult learners and talking about universities and accommodating and growing adult learner populations, Daryl had asked another follow-up question.
Sure.
Do you think universities know how to recruit adult learners? It says, we have a model built to create the traditional 18, you know, to 23-year-olds to recruit them, but what do you think recruitment for adult learners would look like?
Yeah, I don't think we do a great job at that. Some institutions are more geared towards that, and they do it. I see a lot of online institutions that figure out a way to market and advertise in a way that gets in front of the eyes of adult learners. But I'll just speak to the experience my mother had in terms of how did she get back into university. They had the University of Bridgeport actually went to her job, and they did like pop-ups where they recruited students, folks that were working at her organization. She was working for a nonprofit, and they went to the institution and recruited people. I think that makes more sense. And then she had a cohort of folks who actually worked at her organization, and they had some classes that met on her where she worked, and then they had some classes where she had to go on campus. So when we're thinking about developing these cohort programs for adult learners, we have to be intentional about where are they having classes. Are we being accommodating to their work and life schedule? Are these classes in the evening? Or, how are we providing these course offerings? And I thought that was innovative to actually have the classes at the work site. So now there's no excuse, you get off work and then you go to class. Or the jobs were accommodating, having these partnerships become helpful because then the job becomes accommodating to the student. So they're not worried about, well, if I go to class, I'm going to miss out on work and I'm missing out on money. Whereas the jobs were like, okay, we're going to carve out this hour where you can take a class in the middle of the workday. So I think we just have to really remodel what we're thinking about if we want adult learners at our institutions.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think Dr. Alston made a comment that's similar too, that about the online environment,
yeah.
Allowing, more flexibility. And you mentioned, having some more interest in going in that direction too, because most, face-to-face programs aren't really supporting adult learners, and, online might be offering some flexibility there as well.
Yeah, or at least I like online in a way that they can have this face-to-face interaction with their professors, not just asynchronous where it's just they're learning from modules, but having some interaction. I think that's important. I think that's part of what makes college and just education environment unique, is that you have opportunities to build with people real time. So I hope that as online institutions are thinking about the offerings, that they're having those opportunities to have some synchronous learning.
I think they will be doing so now if they have.
Yeah, definitely now. I think everyone's Zooming and Google Meeting, all sorts of things now for classes, which is great.
I see I have another question here from Charles about asking if your community college transfer student participants talk about pathway programs.
So if he's referring like from pathways from the community college to the 4-year, no, that necessarily wasn't the connection. Which I will say, a lot of them went to 4-year institutions, not in the state they went to the community college at. So that just may be unique to these particular individuals. But I just like in the state of Maryland where I am, a lot of times there are these pathway programs to help you easily transition from a community college to a 4-year public institution. But oftentimes they didn't talk about that. They also talked about there was programs at the community college level that helped them navigate the community college. And then there was those transfer or adult learner programs at the 4-year institution that helped them navigate. But there wasn't necessarily a combination of the two to help them bridge that.
Thank you. And I have another question here asking that it says that you mentioned that Black males perform better with Black male teachers. Can you expound a little more here?
Yeah, so some of the research quantitatively have looked at race matching. So in terms of when students have access to the same race teacher or same race gender teacher, that they look at performance metrics. And then for Black males in particular, if they have access to a Black male teacher, they're more likely to have higher educational outcomes than if they did not. Yeah, that's Gershenson et al. It's a 2017 piece as well. There's some scholars of color, Donald Eastonbrooks, who's doing work on ethnic matching for scholars of color. He has a new book that just came out for students of color, ethnic matching and students of color. It just came out in 2019. There's a lot of folks, Travis Bristol's work. My work focuses on this area, Conrad Gist. There's a lot of folks who are actually been looking at this area. I can forward if you have questions. Feel free to email me. I can send you a bunch of material.
And does that follow? And there's another question from Dr. Lisa Brown about mentoring opportunities, which kind of is similar lines there. What types of mentoring opportunities did the participants have with other Black men off campus?
Yeah, so they talked about, and not particularly in this study, because this wasn't my focus necessarily, but my other work, they called it the two-way peer support, where they felt that being an older Black male, they had a responsibility in their classroom to be a let's say sage or guide for the younger Black men in class. And so they often found those opportunities where they could to like guide folks in the right direction. They talk about being, I can't have my little brother, which they refer to a lot of the younger students, I can't have them floundering in class and those types of things. So someone will pull them to the side and like informally mentor. One particular participant in this study, Brandon, he worked on the London Stock Exchange. So his work hours from 1 a.m. to 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And so he would say is that he would actually mentor people at like 2 a.m. in the morning. He said, if you really want to talk to me and like get some advice, like call me at 2 a.m. because that's when I'm working and I'm up. And so he took the opportunity to mentor the younger folks. On the flip side, they often talked about that not only were they mentoring the younger students, but the younger students actually helped them out. Whether that's with access and help with technology, but also help with them understanding their children, because a lot of them had children the age of the younger students in college. So they often talked about how looking through the lens of these young Black men helped me understand my Black boy that I'm raising better. So I thought that was unique. And so they saw it as like a two-way kind of mentoring opportunity.
Yeah, that's a good comment. Reciprocity is the hallmark of adult education.
Sure, definitely.
That's from Dr. Brown. And I see another question here. In trying to help adults go back to school, how do we help when finance is a major barrier?
Yeah, I think that's always the key. We had some of this is some institutions are just not right in terms of how they're priced for adult learners. Like, some particularly privates. I mean, some in this area of $60,000. There's just no way that someone could afford to do that if they're managing family and peer, family and working full time. It's just no way to manage that. So I think some of our the way we can help support them is just finding institutions that are lower in price, still have a great programming, but are lower in price that are more affordable in the area if we can do that. And then I think colleges have to be intentional. If they're creating these partnerships with workforce, then we can say like, well, if you have students from this particular workplace that we can lower tuition for them, we could be strategic in that way. I think is an opportunity. That's what they did with my mother. She had like half price on tuition. So that helped her to kind of get into the university. In particular, her school was private. So I think being strategic there. And then sometimes it's just, bugging our advancement offices. That's what we have them. Like, hey, look, we're going to recruit and increase our student population. We need you all to help support us in going out and finding donors who are passionate about supporting adult learners. And I think making that case, now I'm a member of a board of trustees for a university. So putting my hat on, that would be something that happens often, is like, how do we create funds for adult learners in particular?
Yeah, great questions, great points. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Does anyone else have questions? Comments?
We will supply this webinar online. It will be on the AACE YouTube page as well as our AACE website. It should be ready and available for viewing within the next 24 to 48 hours. If there are no additional questions, then thank you so much, Dr. Goings. We appreciate your time and your expertise. And Jacqueline, we thank the Commission for sponsoring this seminar.
Yeah, and thank you very much, Ramon, for your time and sharing your research with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Everyone for coming.
Thanks, everybody.